Welcome to the Gospel and Culture podcast. I'm your host, Ken Nerbos, and each episode I bring in guests to discuss issues related to the world's cultures from a Christian perspective. Welcome, Dr. Jeff Tolle.
Thank you very much.
Maybe just in a nutshell, if you can describe what with your research, who'd you talk to, what'd you want to find out?
Yeah, well, I was studying the stories of people that have left first-generation Hispanic churches, and mainly these are 1.5 and second-generation young people, and seeing what their stories were that described their experiences as they ended up leaving those churches. And so I actually talked to a group of 1.5 and second-generation Hispanic young adults, and I also talked to another group of first-generation Hispanic pastors and got all of their stories and was comparing them together.
Leaving a church sounds like a negative thing, like a church split. Is that what's going on, or are people disenchanted and leaving their Hispanic churches in droves, or what?
Sure. Well, we hear about church splits, I'm sure, all the time in the Christian world, but in this case, no. These weren't, what we would typically consider maybe a higher level leader that, hived off people with them and started another church. These were young people in their teenage years or just after their teenage years that because of things that they had experienced decided to separate or leave those churches.
And so what are they experiencing? What what emerged as themes of why they're finding new churches?
Yeah, so the principal themes, we ended up seeing kind of three principal themes emerge from this study. One was kind of actually a positive one of them remaining as long as they did, and then the other two that were definitely more along the lines of why they ended up going. So the one that had to do with them remaining was what I called involvement, that they were heavily involved in those churches, engaged, participating, not just in attending activities, but in most cases actually having roles and functions in the church, in some cases leadership in the church. And that was a very positive thing. But the negatives that kind of left to them going, one of them had to do with authority. And in the context of authority, there were kind of two, if we want to call them sub-themes that emerged in there. One was legalism and just a heavy implementation of rules and requirements in the church environment. And then the second thing in authority was authoritarianism, where the pastors were using kind of control or manipulation, things like shame and guilt, in order to accomplish what the pastor wanted, but ended up impacting negatively those young people. The other theme that contributed to them leaving was the theme of relationships, that in many cases, these young people, even in smaller churches, had no relationship with their senior pastor or a very minimal relationship with them. So, and if they did have contact with the pastor, it was typically very negative in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the legalism was interesting to me. You have an example of what's this legalism look like, and then someone kind of who described legalism, did they go to another church where it wasn't as legalistic, or how did they experience that difference?
Yeah, so the of the participants in the study, they actually ended up in a variety of different church environments after they left, and that was the good news too, is that they actually ended up in church somewhere. But one of them went to a completely English speaking church after 5 years of kind of looking around and figuring out where he and his wife wanted to go. And in that case, there wasn't much legalism in that new church. He talked about the heavy connection and relationship community that he was grateful to find there in that church. Some others went to some Hispanic churches, but those Hispanic churches that they ended up at were a lot more, I'll use the word free or open, a lot less rules, a lot more love, as they would describe it. One of them, though, did end up returning later on, not to the same church, but a similar legalistic, kind of authoritarian type of church. And their goal was actually in returning to a church like that to see if they could maybe have an impact and influence inside of that church.
So what did the legalism look like? Was it don't drink, don't smoke, don't wear short shorts, or what?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think the question in some cases depends on what we define as legalism, right? And so we might think, don't drink, don't smoke. Well, there's a whole lot of churches and a lot of cultures and societies that might, carry that. These ones for them really went more along the lines of the way that they had to, so to speak, behave in church, whether they were allowed to ask questions or not in church. Dress was a part of it for some of them, especially one of the females in the study, where they had to be in long dresses, and they were never allowed to wear pants, and if they were to wear something else, then they were in rebellion against the church or the leadership, the rules that were established there. So those were some of the elements that were found.
And then there was also some authoritarianism. They were, what did your Hispanic young people that left these churches, did they leave because they felt like authoritarianism was not their thing and they wanted to go to a church that was more egalitarian, or?
I don't think at their age when they left they would have analyzed it quite explicitly like what we're doing.
Yeah.
But in their terms, they just had negative experiences,
okay.
and that authoritarianism was very negative for them. I remember one situation where one young man had become a youth pastor of a church, and his explicit given reason for leaving that church was when the senior pastor was leading some type of service one night or something, and did what we call an altar call, where he invited people to come forward and respond to the message. And this youth pastor had invested years in a particular young lady who, when he first came in as youth pastor, was very closed to his leadership, closed to listening to anything, but over those years had really started opening up and responding. And in this particular night, she did not walk forward with the rest of whoever went to the front of the church with that altar call. And the senior pastor literally in front of everybody called her out.
Wow.
And shamed her in front of everybody for not responding.
Yeah.
And she was just a mess afterwards. And for this young man, the youth pastor, he said that was, like my words, the straw that broke the camel's back, but just that last thing that he was like, I can't do this anymore.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you talked to the pastors as well, 5 pastors.
Correct.
And what's their impression there? Did they kind of get a sense of what you were feeling from these disenchanted youth? Were they basically saying, oh no, they're all wrong, they don't know what they're talking about, or did they have a sense that there was a problem and that they were trying to address?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in my interviews with them, I of course addressed what the study is about.
Yeah.
But I did not address anything of what the young people said.
You didn't tell them, by the way, the young people think you guys are legalistic and authoritarian.
No, not at all.
Okay.
And because I really wanted to hear their stories as well, and how they had come to their own decisions and conclusions. And so I, of course, asked the question, why do you believe that young people, might leave churches? And but it was very much in the context of their own stories and their own experiences. So what I was actually very surprised about was how many of these pastors, pretty much all of them, I'll say, at whether on a small scale or large scale, all of them expressed their concern over the issue, and all of them expressed many things that they believed contributed to why a young person might end up leaving a church with a first generation pastor. And so these were things they were already thinking about, which was actually quite impressive to me.
Yeah, you didn't catch them off guard.
No, and I thought I would, but I didn't. Yeah.
And so what did they think was going on?
Interestingly, they actually said a lot of the same things that the young people were saying, and then added in some extras. So they definitely dealt or communicated heavily about the use of authority, legalism, authoritarianism, and also talked heavily about the need to form relationships with the young people, to invest in them on a personal level, to let them know that they care about them. And it's not just about what the young people have to do or accomplish or be like, but to have genuine relationships with them. So they definitely addressed those similar topics that the young people have been addressing. They addressed a few more things like the use of technology and being, more up to date on technology. They talked about language as well, and the need to figure out how to incorporate more English into their church environment. So those were a couple others that they addressed.
So you arrived at some recommendations. What is your recommendation for churches with first-gen Hispanic pastors, or maybe even first-gen Korean, first-gen Vietnamese, first-gen, whatever other immigrant community in Los Angeles? What do they need to do to hold on to their young people?
Absolutely. Well, we obviously know that that there's enough study out there about culture and societies, and know that in the United States we're a bit more egalitarian and a bit more kind of even playing field, so to speak, with people, whereas others are a lot more hierarchical. So one of the recommendations really is that in combining the concept of authority and relationship, that these pastors really do dive into relationship with young people in their church. And maybe they're not going to be able to know everybody, that's not necessary. But if they maintain those connections, open line of communication, then they're going to have the respect and honor that those young people would want or can give to them. A lot of times, older people, and I think this goes without saying, have an expectation that young people would respect and honor them. And that makes sense to a certain extent. But in a more egalitarian society, the people that are older a lot of times have to win that trust. And so they need to invest in that relationship. And on the authority side, to really consider whether their rules, in legalistic context, actually contribute to the growth of people, or just things from their own past experiences that they've continued, but might be detrimental to the growth of a young person in the church context.
Okay, so address the legalism and the authoritarianism and maintain relationships.
Absolutely.
That's interesting. Win the respect rather than just demanding it or expecting it.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So, you know of any churches that are doing this well, that are holding on to their young people? What's a success story?
Oh man, that's a fantastic question. I'll actually give a success story that may not be extremely explicit in my study, but from one of the pastors that was actually in my study. And he decided to implement some changes in his church to change it more from I'll just use the word traditional, but I'm not talking about style so much, but the authority and the relationship and those elements, and to really try to make it something that young people would enjoy being a part of. And he talked about how he believed that the transition was correct, he just didn't do the transition very well. And so he ended up losing a lot of people from his church. He didn't do it very good for the young people. Okay. He didn't do it very good for the adults, so they left. And so he ended up with a smaller group. But in the last few years, and as I've continued to talk to him after I finished, the study or the interview with him, the church has continued to grow. He is now actually pastoring 2 separate congregations. And with this change in style, he's seen young people stepping up in his church more than ever before. And these are both Spanish-speaking churches, so they haven't changed the language of the churches.
That's very interesting.
But by changing those other components, young people are thriving inside of his churches.
I think that's very significant. It's not just switching to English. It's not like having an English ministry solves it. Yeah. You can have an English ministry and still have a non-relational, authoritarian, legalistic church.
Absolutely.
And it's not just adding a drum set, for instance. You may have a great first-gen Hispanic church with a great contemporary worship band.
Absolutely. And you might, but those things in themselves don't seem to be the primary factors
Yeah.
in the staying power of young people in those churches. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is very interesting. I suppose it's relevant to the first gen, second gen experience across the U.S. and in other communities, and not just to Latino churches.
Absolutely, and my hope is that this definitely can be used by churches of other cultures, other ethnicities as well, as they kind of analyze their own cultural context and see if some of these recommendations would be helpful to their environments.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Tolle.
Absolutely.
For giving us an insight into this phenomenon.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on the Gospel and Culture podcast. And to learn more, go to gospelandculturepodcast.com.